Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, we're back again with a new episode, and this time we have more hoops to talk about. We actually have some preseason basketball to discuss. Of course, we've always said you got to take preseason with a grain of salt, but at the very least, it is something where you can get a little bit of insight into some of these teams and potentially what they may look like, what they might do over the course of the season. We'll start with the new look Warriors, right? We finally got to see their debut against the Lakers, right? The Lakers, again, were without Luka and LeBron. Also, other players, right? Austin Reeves was out. Marcus Smart was also out as well, along with a few of their other players. But for the most part, all the Warriors guys played, right? Melton is still out because he's going to be out at least for, I believe, 4 weeks plus, right? Because he's recovering from his ACL tear from last year. But all their other guys pretty much played. And they looked really good, right? In the first half, it was actually funny because, the Lakers were keeping pace with them, I guess, despite the guys being out. But really, the focus was more on the Warriors. It's not the score that matters. It was just kind of what they were doing and how everything looked. And Horford didn't start. He came off the bench. All of these guys played at least 10 to 15 minutes for the most part, right? And you look at the fit, and he looked like he had been a Warrior already, right? He stepped in the stat line in terms of the box score, right? If you're just box score watching, looks quote unquote minimal, but plus 13 in 14 minutes, right? 3 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists, a steal, 3 blocks. And that's the thing, is that when you watched him out there, when we've talked about this, right, it's not just the ability to space the floor. It's not just the ability to defend, because he showed both of those, but the passing and playmaking, right? 3 assists. He was able to spot and find cutters, get guys some easy looks. And that's one of the reasons why so many people were super high on this signing, right? Because of the fact that, yeah, he's an old guy. He's a dinosaur, but he's still very impactful and still a really good dinosaur, especially if he can manage his workload and manage his minutes. And he fits right in with pretty much everyone else on the roster. They use the starting 5 that they used for most of last season after the Butler trade, right, where it's Pods and Moody out there. They were flying around defensively. They were making shots, right? Stuff looked great, looked fresh. And you just look around and it's like, oh, wow, you see the real depth that they have. Buddy Hield coming off the bench. Peyton's still there coming off the bench. Quentin Post, Guy Santos, Trace Jackson-Davis. Kuminga was there, right? He had, 5.6 rebounds, 4 assists. So didn't really do a whole lot in terms of scoring, but I guess tried to kind of flash some of the other things, right? Because at the end of the day, for him, right, that if he's going to play and play a lot, he's going to have to show he can have a more balanced game out there. So we'll see. But ultimately, we know that he's mostly a trade chip. But, last year we went into the season thinking, all right, defensively, they should be really good. But what are they going to look like on offense? Because they don't really have any other high-level creators outside of Steph. And to go from, a year ago, it's like Wiggins and Trace Jackson-Davis in the starting 5 to now it's Jimmy Butler. And, presumably Al Horford will be in there as well. It's night and day just in terms of the talent, while still being great fits out there. And they kind of showcased, right, even on the offensive end, right? They got a lot more perimeter shooting that you have to watch out for, right? Because you got Al Horford who can get up threes. Hield can get up threes off the bench. Quentin Post, of course. You're not as reliant on those other bigs. So all positives, I would say, on the Warriors front, right? And you can kind of see why once their offseason was done, right, that's when you kind of started hearing the noise from a lot of people about, hey, guys, you got to take this team seriously, right? Like, this team is better than what you might think, even though they're old. They're calling themselves the Unction, and, they took so long to put all their guys to paper. But you just see what they can do on both ends of the floor, and it's just, can they sustain play? Can they hold up over the course of the season and the postseason? Not much to talk about from the Lakers' perspective, just because you're missing a bunch of key guys. If you're talking about some individual players, I mean, Ayton, he's rebounding, he's shot blocking and defending out there. And then, you kind of look around elsewhere. Vanderbilt, he's been in the starting lineup and he's looked pretty good, especially on the defensive end, right? Rebounding, crashing the boards, getting steals, being a pest. And then after that, right, not a whole lot to write home about. I guess Laravia was out there, had some decent possessions, but it's just without the main creators. Just there's a lot of guys that are doing things that you're probably not going to see them do, right? Like, you're not going to see Laravia play one-on-one a ton. You're not going to see Bronny James bringing up the ball a whole lot, or RJ Davis over the course of the season. And, for them at some point, right, Luka, he missed the first 2 games because of Eurobasket, so he's supposed to come back. They have a week off. So maybe we'll have some more insights into what they look like when they're whole. But at least with the Ayton piece, offensively, it's been kind of a mixed bag. But in terms of the rebounding and the defense, right, that's looked relatively solid. It's just a matter of what will all these guys, like I said, look like with the main creators, because their jobs presumably will be easier. You're still kind of concerned and worried about them defensively, which we already knew going into the season. But I don't really want to have a lot of honest takeaways until we can at least get some type of semblance of what does this look like with all their guys.
Yeah, there's a couple things stood out to me, from the debut. Obviously, Al Horford. I think that's the main thing that stood out to me, right? Because that's arguably, one of their biggest acquisitions, right? And one of the guys that had probably the most hype around him just because of, what he brings on the floor. And he showcased that, right? High IQ plays, defensive motor, and he also showed, he could still shoot as well. So that's all pretty dope. But, there's tons of championship experience on this team, and I think that is probably what could take this team far. I just don't know, how they're going to be able to bridge the gap between that experience and then also the younger guys who maybe, haven't done as much. Like, what does a Pods look like in the postseason? What does Moody look like in the postseason as well? Does Buddy Hield kind of, does his play taper off towards the end of the regular season? Things like that. So there are tons of questions I still have about the team, but I think they're deeper. They're definitely bigger than last year and absolutely better. And, I think year 2 of Steph and Jimmy, and then you add in a guy like Al Horford to kind of just be, potential bench connecting piece while also, having some spot minutes here and there in the starting lineup. I think it's going to be pretty cool. So I think the hype is real with the team. I just don't know if they're actually going to win a championship.
Right. And that's kind of the main thing there is that last season, right, they went 24-7 with Butler in the lineup, right? And by and large, beating the tar off of teams. Go into the playoffs, beat the Rockets in the first round, and as the first round as a lower seed. Then Steph gets hurt in the second round, and that's kind of always the what if, where it's like, well, what if Steph was healthy and then maybe they make the conference finals? What does it look like against Oklahoma City? But now you add on to a team that was really good at the end of last year, so now you just kind of have to hope and pray that you can win enough games to not have to hopefully play in the play-in again. Not that they can't advance from the play-in. It's just we've already seen if you're going to be in the play-in, everything has to go right. And one mistake, one thing that goes against you, and that's pretty much it, right? And that's what happened with them last year, right? Whereas if you can be a top 4 seed, it just gives you so much more room for error because you're probably going to have a better match. I mean, obviously we saw first round upsets, right? Like the Rockets and the Lakers. But say if you're Oklahoma City, right? Like Oklahoma City being the number 1 seed far and away, right? Like ultimately that helps them, right? Because then that means they don't have to make a huge push by the end of the season. They can kind of chill and rest and taper off and then get ready for the postseason run. Whereas a lot of these other teams, do have to make a push where they have to win every game, win at all costs, play heavy minutes. So that's the part where I think for the Warriors, at least with the added depth, like this will be able to in game, right? Hopefully give these guys a breather where they don't have to put up crazy stat lines every night just to be able to win and play 40 minutes. And like, hopefully you can have games where they look human-ish and then they can still, get carried over the top by whatever else you need from the supporting cast. And that's the nice thing with all these veterans is you don't have to go through a lot of growing pains to make everything work. They know how to play. They know how to fit alongside one another. And so that kind of takes away these long stretches where it looks kind of clunky, right? Because as I mentioned, I know LeBron, Luka, and Austin were out, but if you look at the other end, right, looked a little bit more clunky, right, in terms of guys trying to figure out things, right, where, Ayton's a new addition to the Lakers, right, and guys kind of have to figure out, all right, where does he like the ball on the floor, right, like what are his spots, what angles can he potentially catch lobs at, right, he's not quite as athletic as some of the other bigs that say some of the Lakers have had, or, even Luka's had, right, and all these other guys, right, like LaRavia, right, like he's got to figure out where is he going to be on the floor. Same with all these other guys, right? And it's a transition, right? Whereas for the Warriors, it's a smooth introduction, right, for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and if you want, you can toss in some Laker thoughts. I know we already talked about them, so we don't need to talk about them in detail again.
Yeah.
And it's just like I said, it's not as much to say. because
Yeah.
really the highlight and the spotlight was on Golden State because we hadn't seen them at all.
Yeah, it was their debut, but with the Lakers, I mean, it's kind of hard to judge, right? Because you didn't have Luka or Bron, and that's to be expected, right? So, and that's where you look at preseason; it's somewhat of a warm up for a lot of these other guys, and I think that's kind of what it is, for Golden State. I think if they're going to take the preseason this serious, then it's clear that they really do have some championship aspirations. But as for the Lakers, like I said, it's kind of really hard to judge when you don't have your two best players out there.
Yeah, so yeah, and we'll see. And that's kind of one of the things about preseason where the records itself don't necessarily always correlate, right? Like we've seen teams, play really well in the preseason and still be really good. And then we've seen teams play really well in the preseason and take it seriously and not be that great. So there's a lot of different factors here. But I think, like you said, the main importance is taking it seriously. And that's one thing that by and large Golden State has done, even, in some of their weaker seasons where, like you said, it's good to see like that they've established a system, they've established a culture of all these guys playing and what they're supposed to be doing. And so, and the Kuminga piece is a factor, right? Because he essentially is kind of a trade chip, and whether or not they can actually move him for something more helpful, right? That may kind of just fit better while still not really being much of a drop off in terms of talent or ability. That will matter because, then that's another player or players that you could just slide into the rotation and maybe be even better, right? Because I think ideally in a perfect world, he just figures it out, and then you have like a crazy athlete who can play both ends of the floor. But it just, from the moment that contract was signed, and it already kind of felt like the relationship was over. I mean, he got his money now, so now he doesn't have to worry too much about that. But just as a whole, right, this back and forth about what the role is, and I'm sure he would probably prefer to start and play regular minutes on another team, right? That's not going away. But they're not quite as reliant on him anymore because now they have other guys that they can put out there, which is kind of the spot you want to be at, right? If you're Golden State and you don't feel like you can really do as much with Kuminga and that's ran its course, you want to put yourself in a position where you're ready with or without him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so moving on, if you want to mention some of the other preseason matchups, the thing is that it's tough to really kind of make any real judgments about some of these teams, right? We saw Oklahoma City and Charlotte, right? Oklahoma City had a bunch of guys out, right? They did play some of their young guys, like we did see Nikola Topic, right? Who was running the point guard spot, right? Had 10.7 assists, 4 rebounds, right? Still couldn't really make any jumpers, right? And the strengths and weaknesses, by and large, are mostly what we've talked about, right? Where it's, again, he's got size, he's got a great feel in terms of passing and playmaking. It's just the jumper is a question. He made his free throws, so that's good. But for Charlotte, right, that's the other team because they actually played their full crop of guys and they still got blown out, which it's not great. But you did get to see, a starting five where it was LaMelo Ball, Brandon Miller, Con Knipple, Miles Bridges, and Musa Diabate, right? Where maybe that's the starting five, and Knipple, right? And in fairness, right, he had 18 points, 2 assists, 2 rebounds, 4 of 10 from 3, right? By and large, you could kind of see where he can fit into this team, right? Where he can shoot the ball and he can kind of make plays with the ball, right? And move the ball around, right? Which is another good addition to the team where we talked about it, right? Where he's like a connecting piece, a relatively responsible player. It's just you look around at this group and you're just like, there's not a lot of defensive minded guys out there, right? Like, there's who's the guy in the starting five that you look at that's like the guy that you want kind of guarding the other team's best player, right? Like if you're looking at just physical profiles, right? Maybe like a Brandon Miller or Miles Bridges, but those guys are more offensive oriented players, right? They're not really known for being high level defensive guys. And
Right.
then, off the bench, right? Trey Mann, Colin Sexton, Liam McNeely, right? Kalkbrenner, Tijan Salon. Everybody played. So you can see all the guards, you can see all the playmakers and ball handlers. It's just the main thing for this team is it just does, which we kind of felt anyways. They're probably going to be really horrific on the defensive end. But I still want to get to see more of these guys play together because we've just not seen their full crop of starters play together. And I'm curious if they mix it up if they maybe swap a couple of guys out and maybe the starting five's a little bit different, right? What do their small ball lineups look like, right? Because they don't really have any high level bigs, that you really want playing 30 minutes a night. So maybe we might kind of see some funky small ball lineups where like maybe we see Salon as like a small ball five and kind of see if you can get kind of funky from there, or maybe just a lineup where you got five guards and LaMelo Ball's your center or something like that. So I'd be curious to see what it looks like. But I'm just glad that we actually got to see all these guys play, because that has not happened a whole lot
Yeah.
in the last few seasons.
Yeah, I was kind of appalled by what I saw, right? Because I think
Yeah.
that there were there were positives and there were absolute negatives, right? I think there were some things that were slightly underwhelming, but I am glad to see LaMelo Ball, Brandon Miller, Bridges all together on the floor, right? Like you said, it's been a long time coming since we've seen that. I think there is potential, but defensively, like I mean, this team is just going to get probably ran every single night, right? Because they just don't have defensive minded guys. They have like high motor guys who probably be willing defenders, but that's not enough to swing your defense to be serviceable, right? So because we already know LaMelo is not a defender. Bridges can be at times more of a offensive guy, and Brandon Miller I think probably has the most ideal build for it and archetype for it, but is he actually going to be a defender? Probably not. So that's where I am kind of like, oh gosh, is this team going to suck again? But I think if they're together and they're healthy and they suck, that tells them that their direction that they need to go in is going to be completely opposite of what they've been trending towards. And I think that's what we need to see. We need to see them have a true sense of direction and figure out what the heck it needs to go down, because recently it's just been non-healthy minutes and it's just been nasty. But Con Knipple I was pretty impressed with. I'm not gonna lie. I think he did a good job of doing everything that you would kind of want from him. Pretty elite shooting and got to the rim as well. So leading scorer as well. So pretty solid rookie debut for him, I would say.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that I'm glad that you mentioned, right? Where you kind of talked about like the importance of being fully healthy, because then we can actually see like whether or not this group has real potential, right? Because like you said, if they're all together and they're still not really that good, okay, then that's a sign that you're going to have to probably break some of this up,
Yeah.
which I feel like you're probably going to have to anyways, because I just don't see a world where if they're going to be good, they're going to have to at least be okay on the defensive end. And I just feel like, personnel wise, I don't see how they're going to really be that great defensively, especially even with when you look at their bigs, none of those guys are like you said, they're high motor guys, right? And but none of those guys you would classify as like high level defensive players, right? Like like Kalkbrenner, I know he was a defensive guy in college. Diabate is a high motor guy, right? Plumlee at one time, was a decent backup big, right? But he was starting for Phoenix last year, right? And didn't really help him a whole lot. And it's like those guys are going to have to be the back line and the final line of defense for a team that doesn't have a lot of defense. And that's so for those guys, they're going to be overtaxed even more. But they're young players by and large. I think you can be relatively happy with for the most part. Salon, we'll see, right? That's kind of up in the air. But as a whole, just the main thing is that let's continue to see these guys at full strength and see what they got, because this is a team that I would have my eye on next summer, right? In case things go bad
Yeah.
and they just decide to kind of make some big changes, because they got a lot of guys that are tradable contracts, and there's also guys that they're gonna have to make decisions on, right? Like Brandon Miller will be extension eligible through this season, right? And if assuming he continues to play at the level we've seen him play, but also be healthy, right? He should get it. But Bridges, will he stay long term? And along with some of these other guys, will they still see LaMelo Ball as a franchise guy? We'll still need to continue to watch and see.
Yeah.
Then moving on, we got some more preseason hoops. Also, we got the Orlando Magic and the Miami Heat. Right now, for the Miami Heat, of course, Tyler Hero, right? He's been out, so we're not going to see him for a little while, right? I think he's going to be out for at least 7-8 weeks or so. So we probably won't see him come back until November, Thanksgiving-ish at the earliest, maybe. But they basically had Norman Powell run the point guard spot. And, with the Heat, I just still feel like if Hero was healthy, like you could probably make an okay case that they could probably be better. Um, it's just, it just feels like they need him offensively to kind of make whatever they can do with this work, right? They did flash a different starting group. Like I said, Hero was out, so that changes things. But Jovic was out there. They didn't run the double bigs this time around. They actually started, they just recently extended Nikola Jovic, right? And he was in the starting five, right? Continuing to flash, kind of the all around offensive game that he's got there, right? They had Kalal Ware come off the bench, right? Which, if that's what they're going to do, okay, that's going to be a different look than what they were doing last year. Bam 0 for 5 from the field, right? But he did get to the free throw line 8 times. So, that's pretty cool. But it just feels like without Tyler Hero, you're probably going to see more of the same issues where offensively it's just not going to be quite enough, right? Powell gives you more juice on the offensive end, but you'd like to have Hero and Powell together, right? Because then that is going to give you a more dynamic offensive backcourt to balance out what you probably don't really have amongst the rest of the roster. It's good to see Drew Smith back because he had some pretty bad injuries a year ago, but not a whole lot to see from that perspective. And then with the Magic, right, we kind of got to see a mix of some of the new guys, like Desmond Bane, right? He was out there, and you can already see, the benefits that he's going to give in terms of being a guy that you have to guard from the perimeter, giving Paolo more space to attack. No Franz Wagner. I'm gonna assume that's because of the Eurobasket stuff, right? Because he played a lot, so they're probably just giving him a breather. We also didn't see Jalen Suggs, right? He's got his injury stuff that he's had, since last year. So I'm assuming they're just kind of preserving him and keeping him ready. But one of the big highlights was Jace Richardson, right? Which was a guy that we liked in the draft, and he kind of flashed a lot of why so many people were high on him, because that's a guy who can come off the bench and make an immediate impact, especially on the offensive end, right? Knocking down threes, being able to also score inside the 3-point line as well, right? And just kind of fitting in with what the Magic really need on offense, right? Because they just had very little perimeter shooting last year. And so now they've added some of that, right? With Tyus Jones, with Jace Richardson. Jet Howard played as well, right? We'll see if he can actually get into the rotation, right? Isaac was out there offensively, looked like a mess, right? Looks kind of slow. And he's had some injuries as well, so we'll kind of see if he can continue to bounce back physically. But I'm excited about this Magic team just because it's nice to actually see what some outside shooting is going to look like next to their guys in Paolo and Franz, and that should give them more room to attack, right? Like you might see even if it's not like the shot selection itself, but just Paolo being able to actually get better looks where it's not just him having to basically fight through a wall of defenders, right? Pretty much everywhere. Now there's going to be guys where, if we leave those guys, they're going to actually be able to realistically knock down those shots. And this is going to be big for Jamal Mosley, right? Because you do kind of feel like, well, even when their guys were fully healthy, right? Like their offense was still kind of weird and funky. But now, this should be more of an optimized team for him on both ends of the floor. And I'm really curious to see what it all looks like. Now you're going to probably, I guess, introduce some weaker defenders. So maybe does that potentially make them worse on the defensive end? I mean, they were one of the best defensive teams in the league. So maybe if you let's say they take a slight step back defensively where they drop a couple of spots, but offensively they go way up because they were literally the worst or one of the worst offensive teams in the league. That's huge, right? Because then that pretty much is what's going to turn you into probably potentially a top 4 team in the Eastern Conference. And, especially if Paolo and Franz continue to climb up the rankings, then that could make them even better and turn them into kind of one of those sleeper dark horse teams that we've all kind of pinned the Magic as. So, I'm really excited to see what this Orlando team is going to look like, especially once they have all their guys, because you can kind of see, some of the seeds planted of what they could potentially look like. I mean, they shot 33, they made 13 threes, on 39 attempts, right? And it's like, okay, they actually have some real guys out here who can get them up. So that's great.
Yeah, it's a young blossoming team. I do want to kind of circle back to Miami. I think I'm very freaking concerned for this team, especially going past the starting lineup, right? I think it looks fine, right? Like, I don't have a problem with Jovic, Wiggins, Bam, Norman Powell, or even Jaquez. Obviously, like you said, you definitely want Tyler Hero in the mix. But if you take Tyler Hero out, all you really have on the bench, in my opinion, is Kello Ware. I don't think any of the other guys are necessarily like, super serviceable, right? And that's really unfortunate, especially considering, what the Eastern Conference looks like this year. So that does really stink for Miami. So maybe they do something at the deadline or something. I don't know, but the bench definitely needs some help. But with Orlando, yeah, I mean, it they look like a young blossoming team, right? You add Jace Richardson into the mix. You hope Anthony Black gets better this year. Franz, Suggs, I'm really just hype overall for, this entire squad, right? You look at it, you got one of the best young players in the league in Paolo. Everybody's, through the roof on him. If he continues to get better and better each year, I think it's just, a matter of time before that team is probably in the Eastern Conference Finals at some point, right? Especially considering the personnel that they have defensively. And you add in all these weapons that they have offensively now, especially with a guy like Jace Richardson, who we were both very, very high on. He's going to be a spark plug, pretty much the Cole Anthony replacement, if not better. So that's pretty cool. And then, obviously Tyus Jones being that calming presence at the point guard position, with Suggs being out or whatever. So, I underrated team for sure. And, this year might be not necessarily their year to like win it all or anything, but it might be their Uber coming out party.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing is that's why it's going to be so exciting to see, right? Because we've seen them in the playoffs a couple of times. But they lost in the first round. They really competed against the Cavs, took them the distance. And then, of course, they were playing with house money last year against the Celtics because they had so many guys out. But now, hopefully, they'll stay healthy because that's going to be a key thing, right? Because they had a bunch of injuries last year. So hopefully they'll be healthy and we'll see the real growth from their young guys. And, again, this could be one, this could be one of those teams where, okay, aside from the Knicks and Cavs, what other team has a real chance to maybe get to the conference finals? And if everything goes right, maybe get further. I still probably wouldn't pick them to go to the finals, but if we're looking past Cleveland and past New York, right, what other team could we see potentially win multiple rounds in the Eastern Conference? And this looks like it should be one of them, especially if everything looks the way that it's been looking so far.
Absolutely.
Then we move on, Minnesota and Denver, right? Number of key guys from the Wolves out, but we did get to see extended play from some of these young guys, right, that they've been having on their team for a little bit, right? Rob Dillingham, he started, only shot 3 for 10, but you did see the fact that he had 9 assists, right? He had the ball in his hands, right? Looked a little bit more comfortable making some plays out there, and I think the expectation is, assuming you get Ant back and Randall back, right, and then he'll be lower on the pecking order, right? He should be relatively ready to be like a playable 20-minute plus per game guy, right? Which they're going to need, right? Because of the fact that Conley's only going to get older and you don't really want to be in a spot where, Mike Conley's really our only capable point guard, right? Just because of the fact that you need a little bit more ball handling, you need a little bit more decision making, especially against, if you're going to combat a team like Oklahoma City, right? That's so if he can if he can do some of that, I mean, you don't expect him to average, a double-double off the bench. But if he can provide some level of some scoring and some playmaking, right, so that way, especially if Conley's not out there, right, you can get some more, like I said, high-level or okay-level guard play. That's going to be huge, right? Bones Highland was out there. I don't know if he'll be an actual part of the rotation, right, because he's, been kind of a guy that's always flashed some offensive game, right? But he was out there. But the other highlight was, as I already mentioned, the other young guys, right? Johan Berenger, right? One of their bigs, right? He was out there 14-4. Looks like he could be a guy that could play some spot minutes in the regular season, which is nice because, Gobert, right? He's not in Conley's tier in terms of age, but he is 33, right? And he is at an age where you probably would expect some nights maybe he just won't have it. Maybe he won't play as much. His role offensively is completely different from Conley's. But the fact that you have both him and then Rocco Sikorsky, right, who can just kind of step in and potentially give you some solid play as a big, right, especially in terms of on the boards and around the basket and maybe even shot blocking, like that's awesome, right? And especially when you got some real athletic bigs to kind of balance out, like I said, Gobert's age. Jalen Clark, right? Only shot 1 for 4, but still continues to show flashes on the defensive end, right? Like a guy who could be a switchable defensive player that can guard multiple positions, right? Terrence Shannon Jr. being able to get to the line, flashing some all-around play, 4 assists, 4 rebounds. So there's a lot to like. I would say from the Wolves, especially their young guys, which is kind of what you want to see because they're kind of like in that weird two timelines mixture, right? Where you have Ant, right, who's, still a relatively young guy, right? But he's awesome. But then you still have these other young guys, right, who are going to need to continue to develop and find their way. And that's what I'm kind of excited to see about with them. And then obviously the Nuggets, right? They're the talk of the town because they're a team, right, that most people feel like had a great offseason, and a lot of people feel like they could get Oklahoma City this year, right? Like they took them to 7, and now everybody feels like they've improved. Right. Didn't look quite as impressive as Minnesota. Again, preseason, you always have to take with a grain of salt. But with Cam Johnson, he only shot 1 for 3. But you can see on both ends of the floor where he's going to provide some value, right? Being able to cut and move off the ball, make the extra pass, make the extra read. And then, you look at their bench, like now they have real playable guys, right? Like Tim Hardaway Jr. shot 0 for 3. But we know he's a guy that on any given night can get hot and just be kind of a spark plug guy off the bench. Did it for Detroit. Right, Peyton Watson, right, didn't take any jumpers, was just like, I'm finishing everything around the rim. We got a little bit more spacing and shooting out there, so that hopefully can give him a little bit more room to get some good play and good minutes out there, because you'd like to have him out there as a defensive shot blocking guy. His jump shot has always been inconsistent, but if he can just come out there and just be a force around the rim, that can sometimes make up for nights where he's not, shooting the ball all that well. And then Valanciunas, right, coming off the bench, with 6 rebounds and a couple of assists. And, now could they potentially run some offense through him as a passer playmaker? You had, a taste of the Valanciunas experience in Washington. And then Jalen Pickett, right, coming in and actually looking like, who could he actually be? A potential rotational guy, maybe some type of backup point guard, maybe if some guys are out. And then Day'Ron Holmes, right, making his debut, which we haven't seen in a long time because, he tore his Achilles in the summer league and didn't play at all last year, right? Being able to space the floor as a 3-point shooter, also being an athletic guy and being able to defend. And that's going to give Denver a lot of options in terms of different lineups, right? Especially even with or without Jokic, because all those guys can play with him. Or if he's off the floor, you can still be big, you can still be physical, you can still be athletic, right? Holmes can guard, 4s or 5s, I would say. So there's a lot to like, I would say, about what we're seeing from this Denver team in terms of the additional depth and the versatility that they've added, where, they're going to be a real problem again. Because I think last year we weren't particularly quite as high on the Nuggets going into the season, right? But at the same time, they, I guess in some ways, maybe overperformed relative to what we expected, right? Because we thought, they're probably not getting out of the West, and they'll probably get smoked by Oklahoma City, but they took them to 7, and now they look like they're going to be better.
Yeah. Overall, I mean, with Minnesota, I think a younger version of them scares me a lot. I think because obviously their success is going to be predicated on Ant-Man and whatnot, and, what Randall looks like as well. But you add in guys who are going to be impact players off the bench, right? Like you were talking about, like a J or, even like a Rob Dillingham. If those guys can step into the roles that they were drafted for, even Terrence Shannon Jr., that scares me, because I think, their identity is going to be, guys who can get after the ball on the defensive end, but also have some bags offensively. That's going to be really, really cool to watch. And I think, Rob Dillingham, if he can be, that facilitator while also having, a scoring bag while not taking away from Ant and what he does, and Randall as well, that's going to be a scary team to watch for sure. So I am hype on Minnesota. Denver I'm hype on as well, because this team I think is leaps and bounds better than last year's team. I think they're deeper. They're more structured, I would say, as well. Like, you lose out on Michael Porter Jr. and what he brought to the team, but then you consolidate that and bring in Cam Johnson, Valanciunas. You bring back a guy like Bruce Brown, right? Like, that's a guy who was very pivotal to their championship success. So it seems like they're kind of reforming their identity and getting back to basics, because I think a lot of people thought that they had Oklahoma City last year, but now I think they're more designed to kind of take them down. Now, we've seen teams where it's like, all right, you build a team pretty much to take out a certain kind of team, and then once you beat that team, well, you might not beat the next one. So I am kind of curious about that. But, adding a guy like Valanciunas, that's going to help tremendously. He kind of can replicate things that Jokic does, playmaking, passing, screen setting, all that stuff. So I am curious what the team looks like. But we already know if Jokic is there, everybody turns into a cutter. So the Peyton Watson thing doesn't necessarily surprise me. But I think they're better offensively and defensively off the bench.
Yeah, and that's going to be an interesting thing, like when you mentioned in terms of roster construction, because we know the Wolves have had the Nuggets number by and large for a while now, right? So could that be a team where it's like, okay, Denver, maybe they beat a team like Oklahoma City, but then, maybe they play Minnesota and then they might have some issues. Maybe that won't be as much of a problem because now they have more size and versatility and juice off the bench. But, with Denver, right, their starting five and closing five generally tends to be the same, right? Like they don't usually have to kind of shift and change their identity at the end of games in order to match what the other team is doing, right? When that's, kind of one of the benefits of the group that they have. But like you said, now they will have options, right? So now they could potentially close with, more, maybe a little bit more of a switchy lineup, or maybe a little bit more of a spacing lineup, or more of a grittier defensive lineup. So there's going to be a lot of things I think to look at for their team.
Yeah.
Going into the season. And I guess you could also mention Brooklyn played, right? They played I believe overseas, right, against Jerusalem. You always have to take these games with even more grain of salt because you're not necessarily playing against as many NBA guys. Anthony Lamb, I think, was on that team. So, that was a guy that was in the league at one point. But not all their guys played, so I think in terms of their draft picks, Drake Powell and Yegor Demine didn't play, right? But their other guys played, right? And, Ben Saraf looked like the best of those three, right? Where, he kind of, showcased, the ability to kind of score while also pass and make plays, right? He shot well, right? He only took a 1-3, but, he was kind of looked at, I think, probably as the best offensive guard, right, of the guys that they drafted, right? And then you kind of look around and then it's like, oh, Yegor Demine, I would like to see him play, because he's the guy that was drafted top 10. He's got the size and the length, but his jump shot's a work in progress. And then Traore is supposed to maybe be a little bit more well-rounded, right, especially as a defense and athletic guy. But I don't want to have a whole ton of takeaways for them. And then Danny Wolf, right, again, continuing to showcase the balanced offensive package, right, where you can run some offense through him. He had 5 assists, he had 5 rebounds, and 5 points. So they're set in a way where like all these guys should potentially play and get minutes, right? We got to see Michael Porter Jr. and Cam Thomas out there, right? So they also played as well, and I'm curious to see how this all fits. But I guess especially because like Porter Jr. is a guy that can put up shots, but he doesn't really play with the ball in his hand. So you wouldn't think he would necessarily take away from what the other young guys do, right? Cam Thomas can play with the ball in his hands, but I am curious to see who gets that starting point guard spot alongside those guys, right? Because they drafted essentially 3 point guards. And I'm actually like really curious to see who wins out between the three, right? My guess is, Demine, you would think because he was the highest draft pick, he would start, but he is hurt. So there's a chance where maybe he doesn't start beginning the season because he's maybe nursing an injury. But, if he struggles early on, he could lose the starting spot. And that's, why I guess it's nice to draft all these guys. But I am curious to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm very curious about this team as well. I mean, spoiler alert, I mean, you and I both think that they're going to suck this year, as they should. But I think this is one of those teams where you just have to really monitor the young guys, right? And they have so many. That's the cool part. Like, you even have a guy like Noah Clowney. You have, the rookies, obviously, like Danny Wolf, like you talked about, Ben Saraf. But we do need to see Demine play because I think that's going to be, one of the biggest stories because that was, in my opinion, somewhat of a reach of a pick because you could have got him later. And the fact that they used all their draft picks is very interesting. Didn't consolidate it to move up in the draft either. So a lot is kind of contingent on what these young guys look like, not necessarily the win column, but individual stats and maybe even fit as well with all these guys is going to be the thing to watch. They didn't look bad from what I saw, but, it is what it is, and you have other odd pieces that are like, all right, I mean, maybe Michael Porter Jr. just pops off this season, taking like 25 shots a game. I don't know. But yeah, I don't expect the team to be good, but we should be on the lookout for what the young guys can do.
Yeah, exactly. So it should be at least somewhat fun,
Yeah.
So we'll see what that looks like. And after that, right, there's still a number of teams that haven't played yet in the preseason, and those are going to be some teams that I'm kind of looking forward to, right? Like I'm looking forward to seeing what the Atlanta Hawks look like because of the fact, and they're going to be playing Houston, and I'm curious to see what both of those teams look like, right? Because the Hawks, they're another one of those teams in the East, right? That after the Cavs and after the Knicks, right, they're kind of looked at as a potential sleeper dark horse team. And I want to see, right, what all those guys look like together. Does Porzingis play? Who starts at the 5 spot, right? Jalen Johnson, what does he look like now that hopefully he's come back and he's healthy, right? Dyson Daniels, right? What does he look like? And all the other supporting cast members like Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And then for Houston, right, you're curious to see because this was a team, obviously now they've lost Van Vliet. So I think most people's stock is probably going to be sold at least for a while until they potentially we'll see at the deadline if they get somebody. But you still want to see who's the 5th starter because Udoka already basically said that Thompson, Durant, Şengün, Jabari Smith Jr., those are your locks pretty much as your starters. But who's the 5th guy, right? Is it going to be Reed Shepherd? Is it going to be maybe Aaron Holiday, right? To just kind of be like a veteran guy in there. Do they go with somebody else, right? Tari Eason, or Dorian Finney-Smith, I think, is still out, right? He's still nursing the ankle thing that I guess he's had since he was a Laker or even before that, right? So maybe the offseason stuff that people had talked about, clearly that had a pretty decent level of validity to it. But either way, I'm curious to see what they look like, right? Because obviously they add Kevin Durant. So what do they look like offensively now? Like I said, without Fred VanVleet, they don't have a real point guard. But you still want to see what it all looks like together. How do the young guys progress? How do they fit around Durant? So both of those teams, I'm curious to see what they look like. Memphis, of course, we got some terrible news for them because they're already without Jaren Jackson Jr., who's going to be out at least a few more weeks. Zach Edey's supposed to be out even longer. Brandon Clark's supposed to be out for a while, so their whole front court is basically gone. But now John Morant's going to be week to week because apparently he sprained his ankle in practice. And so that pretty much destroys my over-under for them. And that was kind of the argument that most people made where it's like, hey, dummy, don't pick the over for this team because they're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
They're not going to be healthy. And that's pretty much exactly what we're seeing right now. So that's pretty bad. But after that, other teams that I'm going to be curious to look at, right? The Spurs, they're going to be playing, I think, a team in China. So they're not playing another NBA team. But, Wemby already showed flashes of, oh my gosh, this guy's added on strength, just bullying people. He's also maybe 7'6". So that might be terrifying. So get your rings in while you can, rest of the league, right? Because it may be over within the next couple of years. And then after that, I want to see Toronto just because I want to see what that group looks like together because Ingram hasn't played at all. And I'm curious to see how they make all those guys work because they all need the ball. We've talked about them a bunch. The Mavs, of course, you want to see what that looks like with their bigs. Gafford's going to be out, of course, for the next few weeks because of an ankle injury. And then Kyrie's obviously going to be out for a while. But you do want to see what it looks like. And those are the games that will be coming up at least Monday. And then after that, right, Utah, what do their young guys look like? And then Portland, want to see them as well. So don't really want to see the Kings, but like I said, there's a lot to look forward to, I would say, coming up.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the Clippers. What they look like. I'm looking forward to the Spurs, like you said. Yeah, the Clips have been freaking wild. They're like the guy figured it out. Wizards, obviously. I mean, for obvious reasons, right? Like that's my team. But I would also say Atlanta for sure. That's the one that I'm really looking forward to, and Houston as well, like you talked about. Like, I mean, there's just so many debuts that we kind of just have to see. Guys with new teams, new identities, all that stuff. So I'm pretty hyped. I think preseason's a good little teaser for us.
Exactly right, and that's going to be the fun part as we get through this. So, and we'll continue to talk and discuss about those as they go on. So now In terms of news and rumors, right now that we're at the preseason, we're going to get a little bit of a breather, I would say. I mean, I know that I believe we were kind of getting some stuff about LeBron's going to be sharing something tomorrow, right? I don't know what it's going to be, right? Potentially, some people mentioned like potentially a second decision, right? He said it's going to be tomorrow at noon. Like I said, I don't know what it's going to be. Most of his stuff that he's been teasing has been media related. So I would assume it would be that, right? Some people think, could it be him announcing his retirement? Who knows, right? But this will be something that will kind of be sticking with the Lakers for a while, just because, it's something that everybody's going to be talking about because, of course, he's in the last year of his deal and we don't know what's going to happen after that. Nobody does.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he said the second decision, so I'm very curious what this is going to be. So I think the hype is real for it, though.
Yeah. Then moving on, as we normally do, right, to close out these episodes, right, we're just gonna kind of go over our normal polls and discussions. So our last one was about the Kaminga saga, right, where we asked the question of where will Kaminga be traded to, and we gave the options of Suns and Kings because those were the two main ones that people have discussed, not getting traded, and then surprise team. So this one we got a pretty decent wealth of responses, but to my shock and surprise, 62% of responders said he's not getting traded. And then the next one was 22% surprise team. And then we had a tie for third between the Suns and the Kings at 8%. So that's interesting, right? And we talked about on the last episode because I had mentioned the fact that look at his contract and go into the trade machine and try to construct some type of trade for him. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Now, Dunleavy, by and large, I think has shown so far he knows what he's doing. Like he seems like he's actually good at the job, right? I know initially he was kind of looked at as a nepo hire, but he's actually shown like, yeah, the guy knows what he's doing, and yeah, part of it is nepo because he's got the relationships within the organization. But he's done some good work, so you would assume that they find something that they can deal for him. But I think it is interesting because that was not at all what I was expecting. Like I kind of assumed that it was either going to be surprise team uh that might get the responses because it's not a specific team, so it could just literally be anybody except for Golden State or Sacramento or Phoenix. But I didn't expect not getting traded. But as I mentioned, in the trade machine, there's not an obvious deal because people have thrown out all the names like Trey Murphy and Wiggins and whatnot. But the main difference is you just have to put in multiple teams. But the thing is, clearly, all the other GMs around the league have figured that out because the last several big trades have involved multiple teams, right? The Durant trade was 7 teams, right? And some of the teams, it was like, okay, do they really need to be that involved? It's mainly just picks and whatnot going out. But it's pretty clear that obviously all those GMs got the message and have done their homework. So maybe those type of trades won't be as difficult anymore. But like I said, I struggle to see like an obvious choice for them to trade unless they revisit the ones from earlier. But I wouldn't see the reason why they would do that. Otherwise, they would have probably just already done it.
Yeah,
Unless they,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
unless they just didn't want to, like combine, add an extra player into the mix, which I understand.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a surprise team. It's probably going to come out of nowhere. Maybe, materialize or mention like, maybe a couple months before the deadline, then all of a sudden you start to hear stuff. But yeah, there is no market. So I'm curious when it's going to develop, and it might be predicated on the guy's play. Seriously.
Yeah. So because if he plays well and he showcases that he, can do more than just what he wants to do, then that's gonna, you would think, make him more palatable to teams. But then you kind of look at it, you make the case of, well, I mean, hey, he put up points for them in their series against Minnesota without Steph, even though they didn't win, right? But at least he showed, in the playoffs, he didn't completely tank, although the expectations were gone, so there's no pressure. But I just think we probably won't know as much until we get closer to the deadline because that seems to be how these things go.
Yeah.
And then after that, now we can read some comments. So we got one comment on that IG post from underscore user 28120 where they said, bro, they just don't know how to use him. He's a beast, bro. Well, the issue is, I guess, the question is if they don't know how to use him, well, how should they use him, right? Because You're not going to use him as a primary scorer with Steph and Jimmy Butler out there. And Draymond, right, even though he's not a scorer, right, he's a big part of how they run their offense. So those guys aren't going to get upstaged necessarily by Kuminga. And, it just feels like whatever the best version of him is in terms of stats is on a different team, right? Like ideally, like I said, he would kind of find a way to fit in and make it work, commit to playing both ends of the floor, not always necessarily worried or concerned about touches, but he's also a young player who wants to play and wants to, have a real consistent role. And I can understand like that's a struggle for him. And that's why the two timelines thing is so difficult and tough, especially when you're talking about a guy who was a top 10 pick in the draft. So we already know that it's that whatever he's going to be is going to be with another team and not this one. But, ideally, I think, if you're Golden State while he's here, it would be nice if you could get, some type of good version of him before you deal him.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what the guy's trying to say, but at the same time, I think it's a two-way street there, right? I think he, as an NBA player, if you're not in that certain tier of guys, right, like you're not, a top 5, top 10 guy, even top 15, you need to learn how to sacrifice. And even those guys have to sacrifice, right? Like you can't be, the superstar on the team. Not while Steph is there. No. So, you got to be willing to do the little things like rebounding, playing defense, and getting after things, off the ball. So that's where I'm like, I think it's a two-way thing.
Yeah, like and if he was doing that, he'd probably be a much more consistent rotational guy. But like I said, I can also understand from his perspective, like, well, I don't want to have to do all that because I want to score, and that's what I think I can be really good at. And I was a top 10 pick, so I shouldn't just be kind of riding the bench, for a team. So, and I get all that, right? So I empathize with him and understand it from both angles.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, the Warriors want to win, and if they don't feel like that he's gonna be contributing to winning, he's not gonna play as much, right? We've already know that as much, right? From Steve Kerr. If he doesn't think he's gonna help him out, he's not gonna get minutes.
Yeah.
So if he does, he'll get more. So then after that, we also got one last comment from JL the Wiseman 2560, and he said they said sign and trade, with LOL or whatever. So I mean, they can't do a sign and trade now because they've already signed him, right? Sign and trade, you do both at the same time. But I mean, I think they're pretty much alluding to what everyone else is alluding to, is that this guy is probably not going to be on the team past the trade deadline, assuming they get some type of decent deal. It's just a matter of what's out there that's going to be better than what it is right now. You assume something will be. And how much of an impact will that have on the Warriors season, right? It's a veteran team, so you probably won't have much of an impact, but it always is kind of awkward, right, to have a guy on there that is kind of just counting the minutes until he's gone. But I think they can handle that. They've been in weird, wonky situations before.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should be hoping that, they get somebody, who can help them immediately, right? Like back from a trade. That's what I would be prioritizing. How likely is that? I don't know. And, would you want to go young, or would you want to go with a more veteran presence to add on and double down on your identity for this season? So I am curious what the end result is going to be. But yeah, he's definitely gone.
Yeah, so we'll see, and obviously we'll continue to update as that goes on. But that's pretty much it for today's episode of the Off Ball Takes podcast. NBA preseason is here. We're almost done with all that, and we're just a couple weeks away from the beginning of real NBA hoops, right? Where now everything kind of resets, and we're going to see which teams have it and which teams may have a chance to win the championship. We're going to get to see a bunch of young guys come in and either, if they're already in there, take a leap, or, kind of make their presence known. So there's a lot of exciting things, I think, to look forward to as the season goes on, and we're going to continue to talk about all that. And if you want, leave a comment on any of our socials at the OBT podcast, and we'll always look at it. And then, of course, continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow, as we've been growing over the summer. So we appreciate all of that. So thanks to all of you for helping us out there, and we'll see you next episode.